Welcome to the Kingston and the Islands Provincial Election Debate. My name is Jonathan Rose, and I'll be moderating tonight's debate hosted by Cogeco YourTV. I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, and therefore recognize these lands were used long before Western settlers have arrived. It's also important to acknowledge the territory's significance for the Indigenous people who continue to live upon these lands and the practices and spiritualities that are tied to this land. Tonight's debate is sponsored by Cogeco YourTV, Providence Center for Justice, Peace and Integrity, Centers for Climate, Seniors for Climate Action Now, and the Kingston and the Islands Partners in Mission Foodbank. Given tonight's sponsors, it won't be a surprise that the theme of today's debate is climate breakdown, food insecurity, and other related topics. We will ask candidates how their party will respond to the growing inequality and the gap between the rich and the poor, made more acute over the last couple of years, and given the news from our southern border, may get worse in the coming days. Each candidate will have a 2-minute opening statement, which has been decided by lot. This will be followed by questions on a wide range of policy issues, where I'm hoping candidates will have 1 minute to speak and then more thoughtfully engage with one another. But first, let me introduce the candidates who are present at today's debate. First, we have Ted Hsu, representing the Liberal Party. Second is Elliot Goodall Ugalde, representing the New Democratic Party. And third, Zachary Taillefer, representing the Green Party of Ontario. You may note that there's a fourth candidate who is also running in this election, and he has decided not to attend. So technically this isn't an all candidates debate, but we're really delighted that 3 of our candidates have taken time out of campaigning to present their policies and platform to you. So let's begin with the first question, and we'll open it up with, we'll start with Elliot, and this one's on food insecurity. Elliot, affordability of food and other necessities will likely be an important and major topic of conversation between now and Election Day. Yeah. For a growing number of people, trips to the grocery store have been anxious journeys. According to a recently released Cost of Healthy Eating report, 1 in 3 households in our community live with food insecurity. And that shocking statistic was 1 in 6 in 2022 and 1 in 9 in 2021. As you know, January, Kingston City Council declared a food security emergency. So let me ask in your opening statement, Elliot, what you and your party would do to combat this issue.
Yeah.
You have 2 minutes.
These numbers are abysmal. They are incredibly unfortunate. Again, 1 in 3 Kingstonians struggle with food insecurity. I had the opportunity to recently speak with the executive director of the Food Sharing Project, and they had told us that their core provincial funding has not increased in 12 years. That spans across the Conservative governance as well as the Liberal governance. So what we have here is 2 parties that for almost 30 years have gone back and forth serving up the same broken system, underpinned by the logics of financialization and commodification of our shared resources, including food security. And as a consequence of this, we have a number of interrelated crises. We have the climate crisis, we have the food insecurity crisis, we have the cost of living crisis, we have the opioid crisis, we have the runaway inflation crisis, we have the housing crisis, and so on and so on and so on. Every election, both the Liberals and Conservatives claim to fight for all Ontarians, but when they get elected, they only and unitarily serve their Bay Street donors and oligarchs. If you want real opposition to Doug Ford, don't expect the Liberals to deliver it, because they hadn't in the past and they will not start now. I also lastly want to speak to those worried that voting for me will split the vote with Ted. Let's be clear, the PCs have not won this riding since the 80s. The candidate has scrubbed his face off the face of the internet and has not decided or agreed to show up to any debates because he's effectively given up. This is a race between me and Ted. So if you want more mediocre neoliberal austerity that got us in this mess in the first place, I suggest you vote for Ted. But if you want better than that, I'm your guy.
Great, thank you very much. And now we'll go to the Green Party, Zachary Taillefer.
Let me begin by pointing out the climate crisis and food insecurity are very real. And while the most sensible governments around the world acknowledge this reality, here in Ontario, they have consistently failed to take real action addressing what many voters consider to be the most important fight of this generation. As a result, we are struggling with droughts and floods. Food prices are out of control, and the same Ontario politicians who pay lip service to these disasters are pretending they have solutions while doing nothing about it. What is even worse is the fact that the Ontario Conservative Party won't even show up to this debate because they don't take the climate crisis as seriously, even if they acknowledge it at all. Big money from big developers and big oil has meant that Doug Ford and his cronies think they have the selection in the bag. It's an insult to Kingston and Kingstonians that they are not here today. On the other hand, we have the Ontario Liberals who love to make big promises but never deliver. Remember Hydro One? Remember the corruption. What won't the Liberals say or do or promise to get back in power? Then there's the NDP who claim that this election in Kingston is just between them and the Liberals. But why should Kingston voters settle for between two failed parties? When Bob Rae's NDP was in power, their policies hurt workers and business, and they still haven't learned from those mistakes. There is another way. There's a party which has been working tirelessly on these issues for decades. A party that answers, that has a desire to work for Ontario, and that is the Green Party. If you elect us, here's some of what we're going to do to address this crisis. We're going to break up the groceries monopolies to create a greater competition and lower food prices. We're going to invest in regional food systems and support local farmers so that we can rely less on expensive imports and have fresher, locally grown food. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Ted Hsu.
Thanks, John. I want to take an example from the report that Kingston, Frontenac Athletics, and Addington Public Health put out. They had a family of 4 on Ontario Works, which had a monthly income of $2,900. And when I looked at that, I realized that something we had worked on in the past contributed $1,100 per month out of that $2,900. So more than a third of the income of this family. And that's the Canada Child Benefit that was proposed before the 2015 election. So in fact, I spoke in favor of that when I was an MP. And that Canada Child Benefit moved an enormous number of kids out of poverty. It was one of the first things that the Trudeau Liberal federal government did in 2015. The lesson there is that income matters. Income can make a big difference and can help people deal with food insecurity. Many things have not been adjusted for inflation across the whole provincial government. So if you talk to people who, in all sorts of different sectors and programs, you'll find that the Ford government has been making stealth cuts to all sorts of programs. There was a big jump in inflation during the pandemic. And I think that inflation used to be like 1 or 2% a year, but since over the pandemic, there was a big jump about 10 or 15% a year. So a lot of things need to be corrected for inflation, and I think we'll get a chance to talk about that later today, about how we can bring down some costs, control inflation, and help people to put a roof over their heads, put food on the table, and have a little left for a rainy day.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all very much for your opening statements. You've all touched upon the importance of, or the challenge of food insecurity and poverty. And let me ask one question or one policy response in reaction to that. Is a basic income a good way to solve that problem? Zachary, why don't we go to you first?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been a long supporter of basic income. Mike Schreiner has been fighting up and down Queen's Park for this. It's a Greens policy no matter where you look. Federal, around the world, provincial. There's one thing that you got to remember. You have seen NDP, Liberals, and Conservative government. They always tell you they're going to lower your prices, they're going to give you the fair wages. They never do. A Green MPP is not bound to what some guy out of Queen's Park tells us to vote for. your choice is good. If you want base income, your choice is clear, and you only have one choice. Zachary Twyfair, your Green MPP. Thank you.
Thanks. Ted?
I think we're moving in that direction. There was a pilot for a guaranteed minimum income that Doug Ford canceled. But other programs like the Canada Child Benefit, like money for people over 70 years old, those things resemble and they have similar economic impact as a universal or a guaranteed minimum income. And so we're moving in that direction. I think the Ford government has been stingy, and so a lot of this money has come from the federal Liberal government. But if there is a change in government, we'll definitely be looking at supports for people of lower income. Bonnie Crombie, the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, has promised to double the Ontario Disability Support Program. So that's just one example of what we could do.
Okay, thank you. Elliot?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Ted here. There's mixed evidence as to whether or not UBI increases inflation. I think most of the data suggests that it doesn't. But something that we're doing is we're moving forward with a grocery rebate, which will provide families with up to $120 per month in tax credits for their groceries. Housing is a little bit more complicated. Again, housing is a fixed asset. So there's a number of problems as to whether or not that works. But what we really want to avoid is what got us into the housing crisis in the first place, which was lowered interest rates, encouraging people to take on more debt than they could feasibly repay. And the consequence of that was prices that were way out of line with what they should have been. So again, I do support this policy, but we're starting with healthcare here. Our entire platform hasn't dropped. It's been a snap election, but it's something we're looking at. And we'll see if that ends up in the platform in the end. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's change gears a little bit, and we'll start with Ted on this question. We'll move to a question on many people's mind, and that is the climate breakdown. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has declared a code red for humanity. We're already living with the impacts of a climate breakdown that threatens our very survival, and some would say time is running out. So the Ontario government's response is to bet on fossil fuels and nuclear power. Do you think that this approach will address the crisis? If not, what will you and your party do to address it?
Well, Jonathan, you're, I would say, wrong when you say some people think time is running out, because time is running out. And so I think you're being too generous to the wrong side of the argument. This government is betting heavily on nuclear power and natural gas, and they are not sufficiently investing in renewable energy, in energy conservation, and storage. That is a source of short-term, this is a source of electricity, power that we need that can be put together on a relatively short time scale compared to nuclear power, for example. And it's something that we need to be investing in now. It's not like we didn't have warning. The last time there was a long-term energy plan for Ontario was in 2017 under the last government. And this government is only now putting together its long-term energy plan. And not only that, they took out climate change from the Electricity Act in the legislation that set up the framework for this long-term energy plan. So this government doesn't care about climate change.
Okay, we're going to have to stop you there, but maybe you can pick it up in the open session. Elliot?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. We have a premier in power who refuses to utter the words climate emergency. Firstly, to accomplish anything, to have the mandate, the political willpower to actually achieve anything, we need to have Premier Doug Ford do that. But secondly, we need to have a viable opposition to Mr. Ford. The Liberals, before Rick dropped, had, I believe, 7 seats in the legislature, and they're expected to lose that. Even if Ted goes forward...
No.
Projection is 8. So even if Ted goes forward, he will not have the seats in the legislative assembly to actually do anything about it and stand up to Ford. Marit Stiles will. It's also interesting, the Liberals privatized Hydro One, and the reversal of that is something that we will do. In addition to that, we're going to implement accelerated funding to fix municipal infrastructure. We're going to impose a comprehensive flood strategy. We're going to restore and expand powers for conservation authorities, and we have a number of other policies as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Zachary?
We don't have time for more empty promises on the climate crisis. As you can see, my opponents care about who has more seats. You know, Mike Schreiner's accomplished more than their entire caucus has. That is what a Green MPP does. They accomplish, they get things done, because we understand we need climate action now. Let me start off with the Liberals who sold off Hydro One to the highest bidder and who are still quietly supporting the damaging fossil fuel projects everywhere. Whether it's Trudeau, Crombie, or the NDP, the climate crisis is just a route to power for them. The Conservatives, on the other hand, pretend the climate crisis doesn't exist while they rake in massive donations from developers and big oil. The NDP criticize, but they've been the opposition. They're missing in action. Their answer to everything seems to be more taxes and more bureaucracy. Just remember Bob Rae. The Green Party will take back our energy grid from private corporations driven by greed, expand the renewable power while at the same time investing in green manufacturing to create good, sustainable jobs. We can have a clean economy and lower energy costs at the same time. But we have leaders. But we need leaders like Mike Schreiner who aren't afraid to stand up to Doug Ford and corporate Canada. What we need to stop more, sorry.
Okay, well, listen, there was a lot of great ideas there, and let me just open up the floor for the continuing this conversation. Ted, what would you say in response to Zachary's argument that the Liberals have dropped the ball on this?
It was the Liberals who got rid of the coal plants in Ontario. And if you want to look at locally, I'm the only one who's worked in sustainable energy. I ran a sustainable energy association here in Kingston. I'm the energy critic for the Ontario Liberal Caucus, and so it was my job to oppose the Ford government when they tried to overrule the Ontario Energy Board ruling, which would have made a much more rational approach to building natural gas infrastructure. I had a private member's bill to give municipalities the option to not blindly install natural gas connections to every single new home that's built. So, you know, I have a record that I can stand on when it comes to working on things that actually reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, so it sounds like, I mean, in a sense, all three of you are sort of on the same page that the present government's strategy about nuclear energy and fossil fuels is inappropriate. But how do we get from here to there? What's your party's platform to make that transition? Does anyone want to respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Zachary.
Yeah, we want to invest into local energy grid. Why are we selling? So Quebec sells their energy to US and we buy it back. Ted, you are right. You are great when it comes to climate, but you know what isn't? Your party. And your party whip votes. And that's the problem with the Liberals and NDP. Whatever their leader says, that's the action we're going to get. The Green Party is going to invest into renewable energy. We have the plan, we have the platform, and we don't just talk about it during the elections like the other parties. We literally run on this 4 years, 365 days a year. No matter the time, climate doesn't take a rest.
So one thing I would say in response to that is, I'm somebody who's actually ran for the leadership of my party, which gives me a higher profile in the party, which gives me a higher profile in the legislature. And that means that, you know, our party is not one where the leader says something and everybody just does it. It's, you know, I think the Conservative Party is the example of that. And, you know, the leader says, you will not attend any debates, and candidate has no choice. So I would say the people of Kingston and the Islands want somebody who has a higher profile in the party that they're running for, who has a higher profile in the legislature because of having run a provincial campaign for the leadership of their own party.
Okay. Elliot, did you want to jump in there?
I would love to respond to that. Effectively, what we have here is an extractive industry that is not conducive to sustainability. We know that, and we know that the privatization of Hydro One exacerbated that. We know that said privatization will always inevitably put profits over people and put profits over sustainability. So if we want the political mandate to properly regulate our energy in the way that we have to address this urgent crisis that, again, disproportionately will affect me and Zach, not Ted, we need to reverse that Liberal decision immediately.
Okay, great. Well, let's move on. I think we could spend more time talking about this, but let's move on to another important concern, and that's housing. And Elliot, we'll start with you on this. So housing affordability is obviously a huge issue, and last year some 1,300 Kingston households were on a waiting list for affordable housing. And in addition to that, there are over 400 unhoused people. We all know homelessness is getting worse. So municipal governments in the province say that we just need more housing, period. Is the answer a free market where we incentivize developers to build more housing? Is that the solution? Or do you think the government has an important role? And if so, what is the role? So in short, what's the role of the province in ameliorating this problem? Elliot?
Yeah, so we've tried this, right? We've tried letting the free market take reign over this. We saw a deduction in interest rates in the lead up to 2008. We saw the overvaluation of housing. We saw the collapse. We saw the financialization of said housing. On Brian Crombie's podcast, Mr. Hsu has said that he opposes long-term rent caps. That's something we do not oppose. And he said he's opposed to that except for times of crisis. But we are in a crisis, right? I pay a lot of money for my rent. I was talking to one of Ted's constituents the other day, and they were telling me they're an 80-year-old lady. They pay $2,000 a month, and that their landlord has not repaired their leaky roof. They live in dilapidated conditions, and this is something we need to reverse, and we need to reverse it now.
Thank you. Zachary.
Everyone feels their belt's getting tighter. Whether it's grocery, rent, utilities, everything's on the rise, and nowhere more so than housing, which has been a critical issue for millions of people in Ontario. Doug Ford's answer is more highways, tunnel, and urban sprawl. His government failed to meet affordable housing goals and lost $357 million in federal funding. Is that fiscally responsible? Meanwhile, the NDP as official opposition has watched housing prices more than doubled. The Green Party will invest in building 160,000 new permanent affordable housing and introduce real protection against corporate landlords who are driving up rent. We will allow fourplexes and 4 stories building. This is a policy that Mike Schreiner currently is pushing in and trying to get passed at Queen Park right now. We'll remove the land transfer tax for the first-time home buyers. Locally in Kingston, I want to engage with Queen's and St. Lawrence College to see how we can improve the student housing shortfall, and can they build more student housing rather than driving up the cost of home ownership. If we want affordability, we need action, not the same old politics as usual.
Thank you. Ted.
So I've been working on this. As you know, I was co-chair of the Kingston Mayor's Task Force on Housing. But as an MPP, I put forward a private member's bill to prevent the politicization, the partisanship, and the backlogs at the Landlord and Tenant Board. In fact, I worked with Tribunals Ontario on a bill that affected all tribunals. Another important one is the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal that has had a lot of backlogs. But the idea is to make sure that we have competent people, that they're not chosen on a partisan basis, and that it's always fully staffed so that these backlogs don't build up. Our party also wants to establish something called the Rental Emergency Support for Tenants. And so the idea there is that if something happens, they can get a short-term interest-free loan to pay the rent, so there isn't this fight over eviction, and they can get over their short-term challenges. We also want to build more housing. So, you know, the problem with building housing is it's not a free market. So there are restrictions on building. We want to allow 4 units as of right across the province. We want to change the development charges, remove them for small units so that builders will build more smaller, modest, and affordable units. The kind of housing that we need in the places that we need, close to work.
Okay, so Elliot said that you're opposed to long-term rent caps. What would you say to him about that?
So we have a program phased in rent control. It resembles what's been done in Manitoba, where there's an NDP government, and also in California and Oregon. And the idea is it's a balance. So if you have people who are worried about their rent going up too fast, okay, you need to control how fast the rent goes up. But you also need to make sure that if you need people to build new housing, which we need, that there has to be, you have to not have a disincentive to build new housing. So this phased-in rent control, which has been used in other jurisdictions, including in Canada, in Manitoba, is a balance between the two of them.
Right. Elliot, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to respond to
Ted's on the record on Brian Crombie's podcast saying that he opposes long-term rent caps. So either the party whipped him or he's changed his
What does
mind.
that mean, long-term rent caps? I don't even know what that means.
That's verbatim your language, Ted.
So how would you define what the position is? What's long-term rent caps?
Verbatim on the podcast, he had stated long-term rent caps. So I'm assuming that means rent caps except for times of crisis. But currently we are in a crisis. In addition to that, there's no evidence that rent control stunts development. There's mixed evidence at best. And in addition to that, rent caps don't typically apply to new builds, so it's not like people aren't going to build new houses if rent caps don't apply to those builds. And again, in addition to that...
You're going to apply rent control on new builds then, right? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying we will, because we don't believe that a glut of luxury condos that is unaffordable will solve the housing deficit.
So we're not talking about building luxury condos. We're talking about incentivizing builders to build smaller, like fourplexes, smaller, modest, affordable units.
Right, but remove...
And if you put on rent control right from the beginning, unlike what we do in Manitoba, people are not going to be able to get the financing to build new units.
Ted, we've both seen the data. We're both economists, okay? We know that the evidence for this...
I'm not an economist, but apparently you are.
You were the executive director of Morgan Stanley Japan. I would hope that you are in some capacity.
That means I'm good at automating things. That was my job.
Okay.
So listen, let me get Zachary involved in this interesting conversation. Zachary, what do you say to these two candidates?
Why should we trust you? Your parties are literally the reason that we are in this crisis. Both of your parties. Look around, BC, Alberta, Ontario. You can go anywhere in Ontario, Canada. You guys are the reason why we are in this crisis. Crisis after crisis. Your plan is more rent control for the NDP, but that doesn't build homes. How will you actually increase the supply? Or are you just blaming others? Because that's what political parties do. What the Greens are going to do is actually reform the zoning office, so then it's easier for developers to build within the city, not continue the sprawl. We're going to, like I said, Mike Schreiner has been pushing for fourplexes and 4 stories building. He's been, what, an MP since 2018? How many other years does the NDP, Liberals, and Conservatives need? One MPP can get things done. A Green needs to hold the balance of power, and that's what you get with the Green vote, action.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. That was a great conversation. We're going to move on to the next section, and Zachary, we're going to start with you on this, and it's healthcare. Primary care is the kind of the bedrock of our healthcare system, and we know that 2.5 million Ontarians don't have access to a family doctor, and that number is supposed to rise to over 4 million by 2026. Hallway medicine remains a problem. Ontarians in small centres are going to ER emergency rooms to seek what normally family doctors do, and that creates all sorts of backlogs and externalities, if you will. So how would you and your party deal with the crisis in healthcare? And that can be either the shortage of family doctors, the challenge of emergency rooms, or whatever else you see as important.
Yeah, well, I'm actually one of those, might be the only candidate on stage today that actually doesn't have a family doctor, just like millions of Ontarians struggling to get care. Because Liberals and Conservatives underfunded the system for decades. Did you know the Ontario healthcare system is the lowest funded per capita of any province? Wolf Island has no ambulance service at all. How long do they need to wait, Ted? 3 hours is the average wait time for them just to get an ambulance over there. The Green Party will fully fund nurse practitioners and pharmacy-led clinics so people can get the care now. We'll also pay for aspiring doctors' tuition, but they must work in Ontario for 15 years. And I will personally advocate for a permanent ambulance service on Wolf Island. This is how we fix the healthcare crisis, not just talk about it. My opponents would love to build more committees around it and talk about it.
Okay, thanks very much. Ted.
The Ontario Liberal Party has a plan, and it's a very practical plan that's already been worked out, and the implementation is already being started with Jane Philpott. But it's to expand primary care teams. It's to have geographic health homes so that people know which clinic will be there to make sure that they do have a doctor or a nurse practitioner. And it's also to reduce the administrative burdens. So the one thing that family doctors, well, they'll talk about many things, but one of the big things is the time that it takes them to do administrative work or to review lab reports or to find specialists to refer their patients to. They don't get paid for that. And we're going to change that by having teams, by potentially paying them for administrative, unavoidable administrative work that only, for example, the physician could do. And we're going to we're going to improve the technology. Right now, doctors will tell you they waste a lot of time dealing with fax machines. And I promised on social media at one point, by the time I finish politics, there will be no more fax machines in Ontario healthcare.
Okay, great. Elliot.
Yeah, I mean, what Ted said was surprisingly right. Family doctors are spending up to 20 hours a week on paperwork burden. I've worked in healthcare policy myself, and the Ontario Medical Association showed that the main reason for family doctors leaving their practice is because of administrative burden. So what we're going to do is we're going to expand primary care access. We're going to cut wait times. We're going to provide fair wages for healthcare workers that were affected by Ford's Bill 124, which had capped their wages at 1% at a time when inflation was at 13%. I was at a rally in front of KGH actually in support of them. None of the other candidates were there. The average wait time at KGH is 22 hours, which is ridiculous. And what we're also going to do is we're going to implement more assessment programs, because right now we have internationally trained physicians that are very much qualified, living in our communities, that are competing for residency positions with Canadian medical graduates. And that's just created an insane backlog that we need to break apart, and we need to get these internationally trained physicians onto the front lines now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was a good introduction to a really complicated subject. And one of the things Ted mentioned was the importance of primary healthcare teams, and I'm seeing Elliot nod at that as well. Is there a difference in the party's platforms around that as a solution? Do you see that as central to your party's answer to the problem of access to healthcare, or are there other important things? Does anyone want to jump in?
Well,
yeah, Ted.
Making sure that people have primary care affects many other parts of the healthcare system. Access to primary care means less visits to urgent care or emergency care. We know we have backlogs in emergency care. Better primary care means more preventative care and early diagnosis, for example, so that the cases that do get to hospitals are less acute. So that's why it's so important. But the organization, the idea of health homes is also something very important. And the idea there is that, if you move into some neighborhood, you know which school your kids can go to. But somehow when it comes to basic medical care, you don't know that. You have to scrounge around and find somebody. So that's the idea behind geographic health homes, that you will know which clinic has the responsibility of making sure that you have access to a doctor or a nurse practitioner for primary care.
Yeah. Zachary, did you want to jump in here?
We keep hearing the same stuff. This is an issue that's older than me, which is funny to say that. I know I'm the youngest one up here, but...
I believe I am.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to compete.
Yeah, it might be good. But how much longer do we have to listen for it? Until there is no doctors left? Think about an 80-year-old right now in Wolf Island, where the ferry is not accessible right now. Can they, if they're bleeding out, can they wait 3 hours? We need to hire more doctors. Why would my opponents not commit to paying Ontarians tuition to become a doctor? Why are we letting our doctors go into debt? You want to know why they leave the province? Because they go over to the US where there's privatization, and they ridiculously outcharge their prices, and they can make a bang for their buck, and they pay off their debts in less than a year. This is the problem.
Okay, let me ask the other two candidates on that very pointed question. Should the government subsidize or pay for physicians' tuition if they agree to work in the province?
Well, this is not something that family doctors are asking for. What they want is to make family medicine, working in a clinic in the community, to make it attractive compared to other specialties. So we have about 4,000 or 5,000 doctors trained in family medicine who are not working in family medicine. They're in sports medicine or emergency room or general surgery. So it's because, and the reason why they've moved out, it's because in our system we've made family medicine less attractive. In British Columbia, they recently started paying 2 hours a day. If you work a full clinical day, you get paid 2 hours to do the background administrative work, the paperwork. And it's working. It's drawing people back into family medicine.
Okay.
It's interesting seeing BC, because that's under David Eby, someone who I've worked with and I've had this conversation about. That is true, but when we talk about the geographic locations in which health is being conducted, you also have the problem of social determinants of health. And we know that peripheralized groups, marginalized groups, have worse social determinants of health, and that produces substantial long-term outcomes. One of these groups is rural communities, again, with Wolf Island. So something that we do have to do is we need to establish a permanent paramedic service there. We need to double the amounts of times that services come to and from, and we need to demand from the Ministry of Transportation a deadline on expediting infrastructure development to actually give the residents of Wolf Island what they need. Because right now, as Zachary said, it's dangerous. If you are in a medical emergency, you can die as a consequence of this government's negligence and malfeasance.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That was a good conversation. We'll move on to the next question. That is education. I'll start with Ted on this. The education sector is by far the biggest employer in Kingston. 14,000 people work in post-secondary education. And as we know, education is a provincial government responsibility. St. Lawrence just announced that they will cut 40% of its programs. Where I work at Queen's University, we're seeing the effects of a provincial tuition cut and then a provincial tuition freeze. And that's resulted, and as well, the decline in international enrollment, and that's resulted in significant financial pressures. So what I'd like to ask all of you, starting with Ted, is what would you do to advocate keeping jobs, these post-secondary education jobs in Kingston?
Let's start with what the Ford government did and didn't do. The Ford government commissioned their own blue ribbon panel to look at post-secondary education funding. They gave it a mandate that to report back and give very sort of small c, conservative, affordable recommendations on sort of, if I could paraphrase it a bit, what's the minimum needed to make post-secondary education properly funded? And they came back with a number like $2.5 billion a year. And the Ford government only funded, increased funding by half of that. So they didn't even follow what their own blue ribbon panel suggested. And that has direct effects on the problems that we're seeing at Queen's University. When it comes to St. Lawrence College, in recent years, we have relied too much on the tuition from international students in order to fund our post-secondary institutions. Some colleges, St. Lawrence is doesn't stand out particularly, but it also relied on foreign international student tuitions. And now they've had to cut programs because the province wasn't funding it enough.
Okay, I'm gonna have to cut you off there. Elliot.
Yeah, I mean, what is clear here is that it's true that the decline of international students is just a reversal of conservative and liberal Band-Aid solutions. But it is worth noting that there is a meaningful distinction between the situation at St. Lawrence College and at Queen's University. Queen's University is this constituency's largest employer. They have a better, They have a better credit rating.
Kingston
They have a better credit rating than McMaster and McGill, and a better credit rating than the province itself. Effectively, what they've done is they've drained one of their budgets, transferred all of their capital into a separate budget, and cried wolf and claimed that they were broke from this initial budget that they had. And they're using this as a justification to engage in austerity, to lay off a number of steelworkers, and to not pay their employees back pay for Bill 124, which capped their inflation, or capped their wages at 1% at a time when inflation was 13%. That's a 12% deduction in Queen's University's employees' ability to feed their families and to pay their rents, and we have to hold them accountable, and Ted hasn't done that.
Okay, thank you. Zachary.
We underfund education. That's the simplest answer. We always seem to have money when it comes to building highway. We have money when it comes to oil. At some point, we have to stop investing into big donors and start caring about our community. You want jobs, you invest into local jobs. You invest into local tuition. You invest into people. Why are we playing the political game here? Blah, 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 I blame so-and-so. Look, we need a minority government. And the best way to get that is a green that's going to hold the balance of power. And that is through, because we're going to make education a priority. And I know we're talking just about the jobs on the upper side of it, but what about teachers in high schools? They are underpaid. We want to also increase their wages. It doesn't matter where in the education system, they're underfunded, they're underpaid, they're overworked. The Green Party is going to ensure that they're not only making above their inflation. We're going to not only back pay them, but we're going to make sure their wages continue to keep up with inflation.
Okay, great. So, Elliot, let me push you a little bit on your characterization of the Queen's issue as one of a solvable problem if they diverted money from another fund. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
So what was the question?
So I think your answer to the Queen's problem, as opposed to St. Lawrence, was that they have a better credit rating than McMaster. There is the funds available, but they chose to not use the money.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the difference between Queen's and St. Lawrence is that St. Lawrence disproportionately relies on international students. It's not to say that Queen's doesn't, but it is to say that Queen's has the capacity and the funding to pay their workers what they were owed for a bill that the Ford administration had put in place that was deemed unconstitutional, because again, it was a 12% deduction in their purchasing power, in their ability to feed their families. And again, it was a complete betrayal of our province's commitment to workers' rights. What Ford effectively did is he told all of these workers, tens of thousands of them, that they were no longer allowed to negotiate their wages, which is despicable. It's also worth noting the Liberals proposed Bill 115, which also tried to force teachers into a collective agreement, which would have had the same outcome. We're not here to force labor unions into collective agreements. We're here to allow them to bargain fairly with whatever their employer may be, and we don't want to interfere in that process. Thank you.
Did you want to jump in, Ted?
Yeah, I could. Let me just say that the issue with Bill 124 compensation is that employees who are not direct employees of the provincial government and were instead employees of Queen's University did not get that compensation. And the province, even though it repealed Bill 124, didn't give the universities the money to do that. So it does come back to provincial funding for universities. As MPP, you're not going to be able to attack Queen's University. You have to, because all of Queen's are your constituents, and you're going to have to advocate for all of Queen's before the provincial government. And you're not going to be able to reach in and tell Queen's how to operate. Your job is to hold the provincial government to account, not to hold the Queen's administration to account.
Can I respond to that?
Sure, quickly.
Yeah, I can, and I have been doing that. I've been on the picket lines, Ted. There was the Coopy demonstration rally a few weeks ago. You showed up for about 5 minutes. I handed you a Coopy flag to wave in solidarity, and you told me you were the only...
No, you did not.
I did, and you told me you were only there to shake hands. I am not there to shake hands. I'm there to be on a picket line as I have with all the other private picket lines. I didn't go because an election was called. I went there because those are my colleagues that deserve better rights.
Yeah, and
that's the difference.
I go to picket lines
That's
when I'm
the difference.
MPP. Right. So.
Okay, well, I'd love to continue this conversation, but we've got a few more subjects I'd like to cover. So let's start with Elliot on this question, and it's kind of the elephant in the room. As we're having this debate, the President of the United States has imposed significant tariffs on Canada's steel and aluminum industry and threatens more in 30 days. Premier Ford has said he called this $190 million election because he needs a mandate to negotiate with the president. How serious do you think that this threat is as we approach the March tariff deadline? And what do you think, if your party were in power, you would do differently?
Yeah, I mean, despite what Ford thinks, obviously tariffs are primarily a federal responsibility. Having said that, there are a number of things we can do and we will do, and that's going to start with tariff-proofing Kingston. What we do know is that austerity strangles growth. If you want to stimulate aggregate demand, you need to put more money into the pockets of working class families. We know that working class families spend 95 to 110% of what they make. We know that the top 1% spends maybe 2% of what they make, and that's not conducive to a good economy. So when you have the Conservatives' Bill 124, or you have the Liberals' Bill 115, which stunts workers' ability to negotiate for better pay, what you have is a complete reduction in aggregate demand, and that's not going to be conducive to challenge Mr. Trump's tariffs effectively. Thank you.
Thanks. Zachary.
This has been an issue for decades. We knew this was coming. I don't understand why the NDP, Liberals, and Conservatives, not Greens, sorry, act surprised on this. This is what happens when you invest into big business that is from the U.S. Like the Liberal government, when they were in power, they raised taxes on small business while handing subsidies to big corporations, just like the Conservatives are doing now. How is that fair? The NDP claims to support Canadian business, but how? They're going to tax them and make it harder for them to survive by making the NDP is just more bureaucracy when it comes to that. The Greens do not support corporate socialism. Small business are the backbone of our economy, but they're getting crushed while big corporates get handouts from Doug Ford and the Trudeau Liberals. The Liberals raised taxes on small business when they were in power, the Conservatives ignored them, and the NDP pushed policies that make it harder for them to survive. The Green Party will cut small business taxes, provide grants and interest-free loans. We will break up the grocery and telecom monopolies to lower costs and invest in local supply chains so our business can compete. We need to bring back entrepreneur spirit. We don't work for big corporation. I work for you, the voter.
Thanks. Ted.
So to get back to your question about tariffs, it turns out that the Eastern Ontario Wardens Caucus has done a study of different counties, county by county in Eastern Ontario. And Frontenac County exports by far and away more, by billions of dollars more than other counties. So we are the most trade exposed county in Eastern Ontario. And so we need a local representative who can speak up for that and talk to business and understand what's going on and what the risks are. So one of the things I've done recently is I spoke to somebody who runs a place where they manufacture swimming pools, and about 60% of their exports go to the United States. So if there are tariffs, they're going to immediately lay off people because they're not going to be able to sell to the United States. And what I did was I spoke to our federal representative and said, if these tariffs get imposed, can we, in Canada's response, impose tariffs on any pools or pool supplies or whatever coming from the United States? Because it's a direct response to something in our area that is going to be affected by Trump's tariffs and result in job losses.
Okay. Any comments from the other two?
Yeah, I just want to say in supporting small businesses, we cannot have a permanent workforce, and I've talked to small business owners and they tell me that we do not have the retention for a permanent workforce if said workforce cannot find housing, if said workforce struggles with food insecurity, and we know that they do. We know that 1 in 3 people in this constituency struggle with food insecurity. So again, I take a very Keynesian approach to this. We need to re-inject capital into the pockets of working class families in order to protect our local economies from these tariffs.
Okay. Yeah, Ted.
I'll just throw in a piece of our platform, which actually was an actual private member's bill from my colleague, MPP Stephanie Bowman, and that was to cut small business taxes by half. That was a bill put forward. There was a vote on it, and of course the Conservative majority voted it down. But it's direct action, and it's part of our election platform as well.
Okay, great. We've got time for one last question before we do concluding statements. This has been a really great conversation. And your comments to each other, which I think is being generally respectful and thoughtful about your position and your colleagues' position, raises the broader question about trust in government. And it's safe to say that Canadians don't hold politicians in high esteem. And perhaps as evidence of that, in the 2022 provincial election, voting turnout in the provincial election was at its all-time lowest at 43%, I think. People just don't bother to vote. So let me ask you a personal question, and we'll start with you, Zach. Why would you consider running for office when trust in politicians is so low? What do you think you can contribute to changing that narrative?
First, I got involved in politics at a young age. I was a black sheep in my family because none of them voted until I was 18. And it was the ability to change people, to get them to go vote. You know, it's a tough question every politician gets asked. The old saying is, you know, the most scariest words from a politician's mouth is, "Hi, I'm here to help you." But this is why I ran as a Green, is because I'm allowed to be myself. I can say this. If Mike Striner's not going to come down here and tell me how to vote, like my colleagues, their party leaders will, Other parties work for their corporate overlords and the vanity of their party leaders. I work for Kingston. That is a great thing about the Green Party. We recognize that with voting threatens MPPs to vote the party line or else. It's bad for voters. If there is a bill or issue which is vital to Kingston's interests, I will act for Kingstonians first, without fear of having the leadership punish my position or expel me from the party. Just ask the NDP about Sarah Jama and Hamilton Centre. They have no issues of kicking any MPP out of their caucus when they don't support them.
Okay, great. Ted.
Well, I got into politics to work on really tough problems. And I got my start working on hard problems in science, some of them intractable. If you go into politics, you will be no stranger to problems that seem to be intractable, but they're worth working on. And so when it comes to earning trust, I work on them, I talk to people, and you just keep at it, and you get to let people get to know you over time. And I think it takes time to build trust. You can lose trust overnight, but it takes time to build trust. You have to meet people face to face. You have to let them ask you questions, which you then have to answer. You have to be trusted in the small things, so people will trust you in the big things. So it's a whole job to earn the trust of people. But if you can honestly answer the question, like, why did you get into politics? I think that's a really good first step in building trust.
Excellent. Elliot.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is me and none of my colleagues will ever own a home. I don't have a family doctor, right? People talk about how they're nonpartisan, how they're not political, but the fact of the matter is your landlord is political, your employer is political, any bureaucrat you've ever dealt with is political. And that's partially why I got into politics. I joke that I'm better with a megaphone than I am a microphone, and I've been struggling to fit this sort of suit, but I am here. I got to give a speech at City Hall last week. I've given many speeches outside of City Hall with a megaphone, but never one inside, so it took me back quite a bit. But I believe last week Ted had said on Global News that his advice to young people was to get involved. So I'm here, Ted. I'm involved, and that's
Fantastic.
why I'm running.
It's good that you're involved.
Excellent. Well, this has been a really great conversation. We're going to have to go to closing comments, and I'm going to start with Zachary. And I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball to you and our timer. And I'm going to ask you to keep your closing comments to 1 minute each. So, Zachary, last thoughts to you for 1 minute.
The cost of living is crushing people. I feel it too. Every time I buy groceries, every time I pay a bill, but instead of helping the Liberals and Conservatives protect big corporations while small business owners struggle and families fall behind. I'm sick of living in a province where the choice is either between my rent or food. And then, on top of that, you then have medical bills. Why? I want you to think for a minute. Was your life better under Bob Rae's? Was it better under the Liberals? Was it better under the Conservatives? You're probably going to think it's the same old thing. You want to know why politicians have no trust in, why you don't trust politicians? It's simple. They've abandoned you. They have betrayed you. This is what the Greens are going to do. This is why I'm running. We need the new, refreshing ideas and change. We're going to break up the food monopolies because we're done with corporations raping us at the grocery stores. We're going to build affordable homes. We're going to make home ownership accessible. A vote. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Elliot.
Cool. I mean, yeah, we can't afford to let our healthcare continue to be privatized. We can't allow housing to remain financialized and unattainable. Right now, 1 in 3 Kingstonians face food insecurity. We know that. That is completely unacceptable. Again, the food sharing project hasn't seen an increase in their core provincial funding in a time frame where inflation has increased by 33% by either the Liberal or the Conservative governments. And that's frustrating. I am a member of this community, as you all are, and I know we're all struggling with this. And again, I just want to reiterate, I want to speak to the people that are concerned that voting for me will split the vote with Ted. The PCs have not won since the 80s. Their candidate has not showed up. They've effectively declared defeat. They've scrubbed his face from the internet. This is a race between me and Ted. So if you want real policies that work for you, vote for me.
Great, thank you very much. Ted, last word to you.
The Ontario Liberal Party leader, Bonnie Crombie, has said that our platform this election is about getting the basics right. So it means helping families keep healthy, put a roof over their heads, keep a roof over their heads, put food on the table, and have a little left for a rainy day. And getting those basics right, it takes away fear. It gives people a sense of security. And all the evidence says that that can help with a range of problems. Everything from gun violence, which fortunately for us is a worse problem in other parts of the province, to addictions, to getting the political will to fight climate change. All of these things are easier if people feel safer, more secure, and have the basics taken care of. And that's why Ontario Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie has said that our platform for this election is about getting the basics right. Health, a home you can afford, and a little money left over for a rainy day.
Excellent. Well, you have heard three candidates provide their policies and perspectives over the last 60 minutes. And I want to say that all candidates' debates are one of the few opportunities we have to hear the candidates and their positions on a wide variety of issues. A decision on Thursday, February 27th, or earlier if you vote in advance polls, is a really important one. So I hope that this debate has given you an opportunity to think about which candidate you want to support, and also, if you didn't get all the answers you heard, to seek out new information. I want to thank our sponsors, the Providence Centre for Justice, Peace and Integrity, the Seniors for Climate Action Now Kingston, and the Partners in Mission Foodbank, and especially Jamie Swift for organizing this and Curtis Brunet for producing it. Most importantly, I want to thank the candidates, the three candidates who have showed what their party's positions are, and for being part of this important debate. It's not an easy job putting your name forward, and I want to thank them for doing so. I also want to thank our timer, Nancy Bailey. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.